Welcome to Inside Indie, the podcast about self-publishing and how to do it and how to hopefully be a success at it. This is the first interview with an editor, Rebecca from Scrollwork Edits, and I'm very excited to speak with her because she is a wealth of knowledge. She has a lot of great information on her Instagram, and I met her through there, and that is how this interview came about. We did have some technical issues with this one, so hopefully I've managed to edit it in such a way that it all works. But yes, I hope you enjoy it, and the links to Rebecca's Instagram and website are all in the description.
How did this editing thing all happen for you in the first place?
Yeah, so I have actually been pretty obsessed with the English language and grammar since I would say, like in high school. And I was actually homeschooled. And so the schoolwork we had like these pages that you could like tear out the pages in your homework. And so I remember I would tear out like all the pages that had to do with like where to put commas and how to use semicolons. And then in my free time, like for fun as a high schooler, I would read my books and compare how they used punctuation and like do all that. I was kind of nerdy, still am. And I went on to get a degree in English with an emphasis in writing because it was my goal to become a writer, still is. And then as I went along, I was like, well, I really enjoy the editing process because I was starting to write my drafts and edit them. And I was like, wait, like I could do this too, and have this be like another career. And so then I went on to do a certification course just to really make sure I knew what I was doing and I knew how to set up my business, got a website going, and then started doing kind of like cheaper, smaller projects just to get reviews, get experience. And now I'm starting to get bigger projects and find more clients and having a lot of fun with Instagram as well. So yeah, it just kind of was this passion that I decided to just see if I could turn it into a career, and it's gone really well.
That's so interesting because so many people like hate the editing side of it. They're like, I don't want to have anything to do with commas and this and that and the other.
Yeah, it can be a slog. Yeah. But I'm very detail oriented. So I love like figuring out the little tiny details of things. And so it actually fits pretty well.
That's such a wonderful passion to have as well, because it's not something that a lot of people love to do. So that's, I think that makes it all the more valuable. How do people find you? Is it through Instagram mostly?
Yeah, so I have my own website, and then I guess you could call it marketing. I just go on Instagram, post content. A big passion of mine is not just editing, but also being a cheerleader for other authors that are going through the editing process or just going through the publishing process, especially for indie authors. And so I'm able to use the platform to both cheer on other authors and also kind of share what I do. And yeah, that's how the majority of my clients now find me, is through Instagram. And then I noticed that there's just a lot of, and I'm not sure why, I think authors tend to be very hard on themselves and therefore hard on each other, but there's kind of a lot of criticism within the author world sometimes. And so I like to kind of help people get centered again and focus on what they're passionate about, what they're capable of, and just kind of be more of that encouraging voice. I always want someone to walk away with something positive. I don't want someone to feel ever like, and even through my editing, I don't ever want a client to walk away feeling like they've had their work torn apart or they've been beaten down. I want them to walk away feeling like, oh, I can do this. I can actually publish this book. I can actually be a writer and get my work out there.
How would you describe your approach to editing? When an author comes to you, what does the process look like?
A lot of the process is pretty standard, finding out what they need, matching it to the services that I provide, signing a contract, setting up a deadline, all that stuff. But what I like to really focus on is, like I said, just kind of approaching it from a little bit more of that cheerleading perspective. And that doesn't mean that I'm not honest. I'm going to be very honest. If a book needs extra work beyond the services that I can provide, or if there's something that needs changing or that needs extra attention, I'll always flag it. I'll always bring it to the author's attention. But again, I always like to really focus on what's going well. And for those things that maybe aren't looking so well, okay, that's fine. Here's how you can fix it. It's not like, oh, this scene is wrong, so now you're a terrible writer and you should scrap the manuscript, and how dare you even write words on a keyboard. It's how can you walk away basically feeling empowered. So I like to empower my clients through the editing journey. And like I said, a lot of that is still pretty standard. For me, I like to also keep pretty closely in touch with my clients. So I will send them regular updates on how the work is progressing. Again, kind of seeing it from both sides, since I'm an author myself. It's like, sending my work to an editor. I want to know how it's going, if it's on track, if there's any issues, and just kind of be kept in that loop. So I try to do that as well and really make it feel like a partnership versus, oh, I'm going to tell you if your manuscript is good or not, because that's not the purpose of editing.
That's a wonderful way to approach it, I think. And yeah, I again really get that impression from your Instagram as well. And I think, I imagine that's why people come to you as well, that they like that approach.
Yeah. I've had some really good interactions with authors. I even had one once that I did a phone call with after I was done. And he was like, oh, like, you're the only other person that I've talked to that like gets what my passion is for this project. And that just makes me so happy. Like, writing is a huge passion of mine. And if I'm not doing that, if I can encourage other writers, it just makes me happy. So it's always a win.
And it makes your job so much more enjoyable as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. No.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit about your writing, what you write and what your sort of goals are as well?
Yeah, so I write primarily fantasy fiction. I'm still trying to figure out what the subgenre is because it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's set in a more traditional fantasy world, but it reads a little bit more like an urban fantasy or something more contemporary. It's more centered on character development than like epic plot lines. So still trying to figure out the specific, like what subgenre I would call it. But a lot of them are focused on character development and just having characters that are very real and raw. So characters that struggle with mental health conditions, or like I'm neurodivergent. And so a lot of it is written accidentally, actually, but was written from a neurodivergent perspective with neurodivergent characters, and just exploring different themes that I find interesting, like exploring prejudice or ageism or sexism or trauma. And I just think it's very interesting to delve into those topics in a story context.
And in a fantasy context as well. I think it gives you a different perspective on things that are important in today's world.
Plus, it's just fun to be creative with fantasy and do some things you couldn't in the real world.
Absolutely. It always helps us if there's more magic in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said about genre as well, because on the one hand, I think it's really important from a marketing perspective to have a clear genre and know where who your readers are, where you're going to sell it. And yet there is something very limiting in the genre boxes that exist out there. And I don't want to be telling people like, you have to write in this specific box. I mean, there was somebody who wrote the first steampunk novel. Nobody's going to go back and tell Mary Shelley, oh no, you can't write Frankenstein because it's too different from anything else out there in the market, and you'll never be able to sell it.
Yeah, it is. And I think part of it is just finding, okay, what themes overlap with the established genres? Like, what themes can you kind of use to try and convey to readers what it is? Or maybe, you're right in partially in an established genre, and maybe you use an unexpected trope, and you can use the name of that trope to kind of signal expectations. So it's kind of finding that bridge, I think, between how you're doing things differently and how to kind of prepare the reader for that difference in a way that makes them want to read it, which I haven't fully figured out yet. I'm still figuring all that stuff out, but I think that's probably going to be the key to making that work.
Yeah, I think the beauty of indie publishing as well is that if one marketing approach doesn't work, and you realize that this isn't resonating with the right people, you
Right.
can pivot and change things, which is much harder to do when you've got a huge team of people behind you and all the bureaucracy of traditional publishing.
Yeah, you can always change, categories in Amazon or Barnes and Noble Press or whatever. But even I think with traditional publishing, it's hard to write outside of traditional genres or traditional tropes or expectations. So I do like that indie authors kind of get to play around in some ways a little bit more.
So you talked about sort of the different services you provide. Is it copy editing and line editing? Do you want to just run me through the different things that you do and what they actually are?
Yeah, for sure. So there's 4 major types of editing. The only one that I don't do is developmental editing, which looks at kind of like the big picture. How does the plot work? How do the character arcs work? I don't feel confident enough to dive into that. I tend to enjoy kind of getting more into the weeds, into the details. So the services that I offer are line editing, which basically you do minor rewriting just to improve the way that sentences flow and make sure that they're clear so that when the reader reads them, they understand what's meant right away. You'll also switch out any sort of repeated words and phrases, just kind of make it flow better. Then you have copy editing, which is kind of an in-depth proofread. So you will check for grammar, punctuation, and spelling errors, but you will also check for style. So for example, in a fantasy world, you'll make sure that the name of a city is spelled the same way each time and that the same name is used each time, and that a character's hair stays the same color each time that they're mentioned. And you'll actually create a style guide for the author as well, so that if they write a second book in the series or they switch editors, they can give them that little guide on, unique words that are used in the world, or just things like, do they use the Oxford comma or not? So it's kind of like a cheat sheet for themselves and for future editors. And then I also offer proofreading, which comes after the line editing and copy editing, and is just one final check for grammar, spelling, and punctuation. So those are the services I offer. I also do a little like beta reading, sensitivity reading, which aren't technically editing. So those are just the different things that I offer.
And do people usually come to you for all 3 of those things?
Surprisingly, yes, mostly for line editing and copy editing. Traditional publishing houses, they will normally hire every type of editor. So they'll have a developmental editor, a copy editor, a line editor, a proofreader. For indie authors, because they're often working on a tight budget, they might only choose 1 or 2 types of editing. So if they know they're really good at writing a plot, they might skip the developmental editor and go straight to line editing. If they know they're really, really good with grammar, they might go to line editing and skip proofreading or copy editing. So because copy editing is a bit more of an in-depth proofread and is especially helpful, I feel, for indie authors to kind of make sure that style is consistent, I've noticed that more people seem to choose that over the standard kind of final proofreading. And then I do get quite a bit of line editing as well. So those would be the 2 most common.
It's interesting that how it works in traditional and then how that can be translated over into indie. And I think the other thing you've mentioned before is your emphasis on communication over everything being absolutely perfect, which I think is a different kind of is a little bit different of an approach to what people typically think of what an editor does.
No, I definitely agree. And I mean, again, kind of coming from an author perspective, before I decided to go into editing, I always thought editors were these like scary monsters that would come and tear your work apart and tell you that you're horrible. But if you think of it as editors, we work for the writers. The writer is the boss. We're the one that's hired to work for them. And so, we're not here to tear the manuscript apart. We're here to work, or we should be here to work as partners. And for me, it's kind of, I think of it a little bit like a crystal. The author gets that raw material and that raw crystal, then we just polish it, clean up any rough edges so that it shines a little bit stronger. But it's really the author that's doing the hard work of getting that crystal extracted and brushing the dirt off and then, bringing it to you. And so I don't see the benefit in putting putting someone down or being really harsh on someone who has done that extremely hard work and is now coming to you for some help, just kind of polishing it up. And so I think having been or being an author myself, and, I have the whole like imposter syndrome that comes up from time to time. Like, what if I'm an awful writer, and what if this sucks? And what if the editor hates it and tells me that I'm awful? But again, as editors, we're not expecting writers to know how to edit. Like, yes, it's nice when an author will go and do their best with self-editing and do their best to clean things up. But if authors were perfect at editing, then there wouldn't need to be editors. So again, it's like, like their job is to write, their job is to create the story. And then our job is just to help refine it so it comes across a little more clearly to the reader. And I don't want authors to feel afraid of editing or afraid that, that fragile self-esteem sometimes that we have to really cultivate. I don't want that. I don't want anyone to feel like that's going to get knocked down just because their book goes through the editing process.
And again, I imagine that's why people come to someone like you who clearly has that goal in mind and that approach.
No, for sure. And like I said, it's not about sugarcoating. I'm always very honest with authors and very upfront about things, but there's always a way to do it. There's always a way to communicate, this needs work, but here's how to fix it, or this needs work, but you're really strong in this area.
So what are some things that authors can do to make your job easier, or to what do you like to see in a manuscript when it comes to you in terms of what editing the author has done ahead of time?
Yeah. I think there are maybe a surprising amount of authors who don't, at least, it's hard to tell sometimes from my end, but who don't appear to really self-edit their work before sending it off. And those are always a bit trickier, of course, to go through because there's just a lot more cleaning up that needs to be done. And sometimes, too, for the author, if an editor looks at a sample of your work and sees that it needs extra attention, the price of editing might go up a little bit if they charge per project. So that's something to keep in mind. So I would just say just a basic self-edit, like just learn the basics of grammar, punctuation, look for any misspelled words, look for anything that maybe doesn't seem to flow well, have, a beta or alpha reader read through it, give your perspective, and just doing a little bit of cleanup helps. The other big thing that I would say just as a tip for clients is that I've noticed there's a lot of clients that understandably don't understand the different types of editing. So they'll come and they'll say, oh, I need a proofread. And then I'll look at it and I'll be like, okay, like, are you sure that's what you need? And they'll be like, yeah, I just need the sentences cleaned up. And I'm like, oh, you mean a line edit? And of course, an author is not going to necessarily know the different types of editing. And I have seen some editors even using copy edit and line edit interchangeably, which just adds to the confusion. So I would just say, as an author, just write down a brief list of this specifically is what I need help with. And then the editor can easily be like, oh, you're looking for proofreading, or, oh, you're looking for developmental editing. So just jot down like, I need help with grammar and sentence flow, or I need help with making sure my plot is good. And that helps us a lot as editors as well.
And do authors sometimes come to you with a style guide already created? So I imagine if somebody's especially writing something like fantasy, there's a lot of stuff to keep track of. So they usually have some kind of like world building tool on the side that you can reference as well?
Yeah, so sometimes they'll have like a list of words and definitions if they're using like some words in a different language or just some different creatures in the book. For a full style guide, most indie authors won't have one because a full style guide will include the names of different creatures and words, and also like specific formatting and grammar kind of style choices, like I said, with the Oxford comma, whether or not they use it. And so with indie authors, so with publishing houses, normally they would have a style guide that they use for their house and that they give to all the editors. For indie authors, it's not as common. So normally as a copy editor, we'll be making one from scratch. But yes, they will sometimes give like a list of words or places or characters, which is very helpful.
So do you personally have a style guide that you would, that if you said you're starting from scratch, but do you have a sort of a list of rules in your head or written down that you would work from ideally, like whether you're pro or anti Oxford comma?
Yes. Yeah. So I personally work the most with, so I'm based in the US, so I'll work mostly with the Chicago Manual of Style. I don't know if that's the primary one in other countries, but it's the predominant one here. And then as far as determining the author's style, I will go ahead because the author's style always trumps the like official style. So for example, like the Chicago Manual of Style will have rules on whether you spell out a number or like a number over this amount, you'll put in numerals instead of spelling it out by letter. But maybe the author wants to do it differently. And so you always follow the author's style. And the way that I learned the author's style, so I go through each of the manuscripts twice when I edit, especially for copy editing. And the first time I go through, I'll just make notes and I'll say, okay, the majority of the time, this author uses the Oxford comma. So I'm going to assume that's their style and I'm going to fix the instances where it deviates from that. Now, if I can't determine, which is in the majority, whether they write out numbers or spell numbers or whatever, I'll either have it adhere to the Chicago Manual of Style or reach out to the author if it's something that I feel is a little bit more impactful to their style and say, hey, which way do you want this? For example, one of the things I'll often ask authors is, what style of English is your book in? Is it US English? Is it Australian English? Is it UK English? Is it Canadian English? Because they're all different. And so that's a really good thing for me to know which kind of style to stick with. But yeah, it's whatever the author prefers. Because one of the things that we say in editing is consistency is king. So even if something is technically wrong, so for example, ellipses, those like 3 dots you use to show that you're kind of trailing off at the end of a sentence. It's becoming more common now in indie publishing to do the ellipses and then do a single space at the end. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, according to the Chicago Manual of Style, normally you don't have any spaces on either side, or you have one space on each side. But we're seeing this trend to just have one space at the end. Now, readers are not going to care as long as you're consistent. So even if you're technically breaking this like little rule, the readers are not going to care as long as you do it the same way each time. And as long as it doesn't, jar them out of the story, which something like that is not going to jar them out of the story. But yeah, see, I could talk about all these little details forever, but it's really kind of getting into the weeds of all these little like, oh, there's a space on this side and not on this side. It's like, yeah. But I love that stuff.
Yeah, not to mention N dashes and M dashes and the rest of it.
That's a whole
yes. Thing. And from a sort of typesetting perspective as well, what kind of quotation marks you're going with, whether it's double marks, single marks, or typographer's marks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of different things to consider.
A lot of these are things that you wouldn't even think about until you go to start editing something.
Yeah. No, definitely.
How would you recommend that an author, if they're just sort of starting out with writing and figuring out how these things work, would you recommend them going and looking at books that are published and looking at what they do, or having the Chicago Manual of Style or whatever manual of style you have you want to go with sort of sitting next to you as you write, or do you just write and then figure out all that later?
Yeah, I think I would suggest maybe don't start with the Chicago Manual of Style. It's fun if you're very detail oriented, but it is a very dry read and is a very long read. There are a couple, I'm forgetting the name, but I would suggest looking for resources that are aimed for authors, like books on how to self-edit. and just, go to a bookstore, browse through them, kind of find one that resonates and learn from it. And if you're looking, for example, that punctuation is something you struggle with, look for one on punctuation, because those books are going to be a lot easier to read, a lot more fun to read, and they're going to cover those basics that you really need without getting too much into the weeds, which your editor can kind of take care of. And then you can always build on that. So once you get the first book and you've read it and you've practiced it, you can try a different one, or a podcast or YouTube video, whatever type of learning that you like. But I think, starting with the Chicago Manual of Style, or putting too much pressure on yourself to learn all those little things, like you don't need to worry about that unless you're interested in it.
Yep. And I think you're probably in the minority there.
Yeah, and I think it's Elements of Style. That's a good book I like to recommend if you just want kind of a little shorter version, basically, of the things I look at.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to get distracted by all of that as you're writing as well. And if you start overthinking all of this, it can hinder the creative flow.
Yeah, it can be paralyzing because you're worried about the characters, and then you're worried about, okay, but what if I put this comma in the wrong place? It's like, don't worry about it. Just do your best, and then do some self-editing, and then have your editor go at it. You'll be fine.
I wanted to ask you as well a little bit about the typesetting side of things as well, because I'm assuming you'll do the edits, and then the author will send the piece off to be typeset, or they may do it themselves. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you have any kind of process to set it up so that it's ready to be typeset?
So for myself, I don't do that. So for that, you would want to check with a formatter, or you might call it a typesetter. Formatter is the one who will set it up for publishing. I don't quite have the skills down for that yet, so I don't offer any formatting services. You can if you're an indie author. There are a couple of programs like Atticus if you're on PC, or Vellum if you're on Mac, which you make a one-time payment for, and then you upload your manuscript, and it actually makes it super easy to format it from home. So that's what I would suggest for indie authors. You can also pay a formatter to do it. What I will do, though, with the editing is I will, even though I might not know how to fix them, I will flag any formatting issues that I come across and say, hey, have the formatter make sure this spacing is consistent, or hey, make sure that you insert a heading here, or, whatever it may be. So, and that's pretty typical that the editor will flag formatting errors for you, especially larger ones that you can have a formatter look at, or that you can fix for yourself or run through a formatting program.
Yeah, that's something. So I do a little bit of typesetting, formatting myself, and it's one of those things where I kind of, when a book comes through and you're kind of looking at the style of it and figuring out where those full paragraph breaks should be. Often when a manuscript comes through, there's some degree of formatting within the Word document, and sort of translating that into, I use InDesign to do the layout, and sort of referring back to that original document and going, okay, so what is it they mean when they put this many hard returns here? And for instance, whether there's a little ornament or something between paragraphs. Is that the kind of thing that you would look at?
Mm-hmm. No. So for editing, it would mainly be just looking at the actual words themselves, or anything that just visually very obviously looks off. But no, we don't really go into the nitty gritty of, oh, there's like a little mark here, there's a little, thing here. I'll leave that to you guys.
Yeah, because I always wonder, like, does that mean, like, if there's a little star in between, does that mean that it's like a jump in time, or something like that, if it's a novel?
Yeah, so those are things that I will look at. Those like little, when you put those three little like asterisks or stars, just to make sure it's consistent, because sometimes authors will put them in there when there's no reason for them to be in there. The scene just continues as if they hadn't even happened. Other times authors forget to put them in there. And normally those little asterisks will mark when there is a change in scene or time like they're traveling, and then you put the asterisk and they've arrived, but maybe it's not like dramatic enough to be the end of a chapter. The other time that I advise authors to do that is when the point of view changes. So maybe you're in one character's head and now you've switched to another character's head. That can be very jarring for the reader. So putting those little dots there to kind of be like, okay, heads up, we're transitioning to a new scene, a new, or at least new point of view, can be really helpful for the reader.
That is also very helpful for me to know. Thank you.
Of course.
Because as I'm typesetting, I'm not necessarily reading much as I'm going,
right.
But it's kind of good to know like why is this here and is it correct?
Yeah. And like I said, that with like the little like break, that is something that editors will check for and will kind of flag if they feel like that's in the wrong place, because it affects how the story itself reads. So you should be flagging that.
Back to a more sort of nitty gritty question. How does your actual editing process work in terms of working with the author? Are you working in Microsoft Word or like Google Docs or something and putting notes as you go?
Yeah, so it depends on the editor. For me, I use Microsoft Word. Just the track changes feature is really easy because an author can go through once I'm done and accept or reject any changes. Some editors, like myself with Google Docs, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking because basically the author can come in and kind of like look over your shoulder at any time and like see what you're doing, or, it can feel a little bit nerve-wracking. For myself too, I'm just not as familiar with Google Docs, so I just don't offer that right now, although down the road I probably will. So that depends entirely on the editor. Microsoft Word is the most common one that I see just because it's so easy to track changes in it. Some authors will want you to do it in PDF, which I do offer that. It is not as easy to work with, but you can do it. But yeah, Microsoft Word and then probably Google Doc are the most common. So for me, doing it in Microsoft Word, that's also another reason why I want to keep authors updated, because they're not going in and seeing the progress kind of in real time in the document. And so I want to make sure, hey, I didn't forget about you. Your project's not behind. Like, this is what's happening with it right now. This is the stage it's in.
It's quite interesting because obviously with something like design, you've got, I think, more back and forth. You're like, here are the concepts, and here it's, here's the next development round of it of changes.
No, I guess that does make sense. I think I just don't have as much experience with Google Docs, so they kind of scare me. I'm sure it's not hard, but
I feel the same way about Microsoft Word, to be honest. Even for something really basic now, I can't deal with Word. I can't.
And see, I grew up on it, and my dad was really into like figuring out how it worked and teaching me, so I'm more familiar with it. But if I wasn't, I wouldn't touch it. At least not for formatting. No,
I think things like Vellum make a lot more sense. Yeah. And if you've got a lot of books that you're doing, say you're a romance author and you're putting out, a book every couple of months, then it makes a lot of sense because it's a one-off payment and you can
definitely
get those books out. And yeah,
it makes me wish that I had a Mac just so I could use it.
Yeah. I haven't used it myself, but from what I can see, it's quite a good program. I've worked with people who are very, very good at formatting, and I was sort of scared in some ways to offer formatting as a service because I'd worked with somebody who is so extremely good at it and just knew every single rule and could do it absolutely perfectly. I had it in my head that if I couldn't do it at that level, then it wasn't worth even trying. And then I kind of realized, oh wait, actually, even if I do it, half of the percentage of amazingness that that they can do it, then it's still going to be better than most of the formatting out there. So
yeah, and I mean it's all like learning as you go as well. We all want to be, whether we're an author, an editor, a formatter, we all want to be perfect out of the gate, and the only way to get perfect is just by doing it over and over and over and learning more as you go. So it's not easy. I'm a perfectionist myself, so I just want to be like, yeah, it's perfect, but it's a process. You have to learn.
And even you see, again, from a formatting perspective, but also from an editing perspective, when you have a book from a traditional publisher and you see things that that formatting thing doesn't seem quite as I think it's correct. Do you find that as well when you're reading a book? Do you sort of go, oh wait, that ellipses isn't in the right place?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because some of my favorite indie books that I read in my spare time, I'll go and look at some of the reviews and it'll be like, oh, there's so many editing errors. And I've got this list of like 7 different traditionally published books in this series by these, semi-popular authors. And I'm like, really? Have you read these traditionally published books? Because they've got like errors on every other page. So, it is what it is. But yeah, no, I definitely see that too when I'm reading through books. That's the hard thing about being an editor is you do see those things. But for me, if there's a few mistakes here or there, it doesn't pull me out of the story. It just kind of comes with being human, I think. And so I don't want authors to get hung up on that, because I do feel like some readers are like, oh, there's one period missing, so therefore this book is 1 star. And it's like, okay, is it really? Like, so, it's doing your best job to edit and to make sure that your book is properly edited and to absorb that feedback. But if it's just a reader here or there that's like, oh, you misspelled this word twice and, I didn't like it, then it's just it. It is what it is. They're there for the story. They're not there to judge your commas. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's hope not.
True.
If they are, they probably have other problems.
Right. Absolutely.
And it's inevitable that as soon as you get your, whether you're going through, KDP or whether you're going through it, getting a big print run done of a book, as soon as you get that first book, you open it up and you will see a typo. Absolutely. It's just the rule of publishing.
Absolutely. The person who led my certification program when I got certified to do editing, she works with traditionally published books, and she'll say that sometimes the book will go through 4 other editors before it lands on her desk, and she'll still catch errors from those 4 other editors that have gone through it. So, yeah.
Yeah, same when I'm formatting something, I'll sometimes pick up on errors, even though I know it's been through an editor or 2 but beforehand. Right. And we all look at things slightly differently as well. And there are things that will jump out to one person that won't to another. And probably, I imagine then when, if you're having an audiobook produced, probably the narrator is then going, oh, hang on, that's not quite right. Or that word doesn't quite fit.
Right. I'm sure. Yeah, I've wondered that myself, but I'm sure they have to make some decisions there.
No, I'd love to be kind of behind the scenes and see how that
interview
all works.
An audiobook narrator next.
Absolutely. Do you know anyone who narrates audiobooks?
No.
Yeah.
I wish.
You could find somebody. Yeah. Well, that seems like a sort of natural place to wrap things up.
Yeah.
Where can people go to find you? Because I'm sure you're going to have some people who are thinking, oh, yeah, this Rebecca person seems like a good person to edit my book.
Yeah, so they can find me at www.scrollworkedits.com. So that's scroll like the Dead Sea Scrolls, just scrollworkedits.com. Or you can look me up on Instagram under Scrollwork Edits. Probably you can type in Rebecca Sharp as well and pull me up that way. But yeah, those will be the main places to find me.
Definitely recommend your Instagram. It's a delight.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad. It feels good hearing that.
Keep up the amazing work. And thank you so much for all your knowledge and wisdom. It's been very helpful to me as well. And I'm sure it will be very helpful to our listeners too.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun just getting to chat about all these cool topics.
Yeah.